everyone, welcome back to my channel. So it's been a bit since I've done a reading update over here. I do them pretty consistently on Patreon with everything that I'm reading, but I don't do them over here as much. Like, I stopped doing wrap-ups a long time ago. My glasses are super dirty. But I started just kind of talking about the best books that I read each month because I read a lot. So that is what I'm here to do. I'm gonna get you caught up on what I've read up until this point of the year. I really didn't read, I don't think I read anything in January at all, which is weird for me. But I hit my stride as we got into February, so I read a lot, but not everything stuck out to me, so I'm going to talk about the best things that I've read. The first one being Running Wild by K.A. Tucker. This is Wild series number 3, and this is kind of the start of a new romance. We are no longer following Jonah and Calla, even though we do get to see them in this book, but we are following Marie, who is a veterinarian who lives up in Alaska, and it is her hate to love romance with a guy, Musher. He runs his own kennel essentially and does like the Iditarod and long dog sled races, and their relationship starts off pretty rocky. They hate each other from the beginning, and then their feelings start to change as they get to know each other better. I loved this. I loved this so much. Not only because we are getting small town feels in rural Alaska, we are getting to see all of the characters that we know and love from The Simple Wild, but we got animal care representation, and it was so thoroughly researched, both from the veterinarian side and from the dog sled racing world. It's very interesting to see how she kind of took a very biased sport and explored it in a very like conversational way in this book. So I loved it just because while I don't know anything about dog sled racing, I'm very involved in the horse racing world, which has very similar controversies and situational type of things as far as like good trainers and bad trainers and good breeders and bad breeders and things like that. So it discussed a lot about animal husbandry, and it was so good. It was so good. The little vet care animal lover soul in me just adored this book, and then the romance reader also adored this book, so therefore all of me adored this book. The end. Okay, next I want to talk about this series. This is the Black Jewels trilogy by Anne Bishop. Book 1 is Daughter of the Blood, book 2 is Heir to the Shadows, and book 3 is Queen of the Darkness. So I finally tackled this trilogy. I have always wanted to read this because this series, along with a couple others, have basically always been the cornerstones to modern fantasy romance writers. Like, these are the stories that inspired Sarah J. Maas. These are the stories that inspired J.R. Ward and Kelly Armstrong and Jennifer L. Armentrout. Like, all the authors that are kind of like the powerhouses of the market now were inspired by these old 80s or 90s or early 2000s fantasy stories written by women that feature sometimes romance, but usually really kick-ass female leads. Okay, so this series, I loved it and I hated it. So I went in kind of with a skewed perspective, I think. Because I knew that backstory of like this being like the OG for a lot of fantasy romance authors, I assumed the romance would be pretty heavy in this book. It's not. We don't get it literally until book 3, because we meet our female lead when she's a child in this book. And there are some kind of like uncomfy moments that I feel like if this series had released nowadays, it would have been like canceled or something, because we know who the relationship is going to be from the beginning, but we meet her when she's very young and we meet him when he's hundreds of years old. But because it's a fantasy world, people age differently. So he knows that he is meant to be with her in the future, like their souls kind of connect on their first meeting. So he knows that he just kind of has to like wait for her to grow up. So it's giving me like icky Renesmee Jacob vibes, but at the same time, like, we're aware of what's happening. I could have done without the like inner monologue of him at the beginning of the series, of him like restraining himself. That was weird, uncomfy. But as the story goes, that becomes like a backseat thing. The main selling point of this series is that this is a matriarchal society and the women are badasses. The women are so incredibly powerful and the men all defer to them. Basically, like, there's rankings with jewels in this world, and if you have so much power, you can carry darker and darker jewels. Obviously, like, the lighter jewels are like the everyday people who might have like a glimpse of magic, and the people who wear like ebony, like the black jewels, are like the most powerful in the land. And I just like that all of the men basically defer their powers to whatever women are more powerful to them, and the men are all the consorts. The men are also controlled by cock rings in this world. I said it. Are you intrigued now? Because that would have sold me if I knew that going into this world. The men are literally used as prostitutes in this world. The men are controlled by rings of abstinence, to interpret that as you will. And it was so satisfying and refreshing to read a high fantasy world where all of the women are sitting on the thrones and the men are literally their pets at their feet. And I was just like, you know what? Bring it. Bring it on. So the basic premise of this entire book, obviously we are following the daughter heir and queen. It's the same person. Janelle is this child we meet in book 1. She's in her 20s in book 3. And we basically know from the birth of her that she is going to be more powerful than anything the world has ever seen. Like, the amount of power that people can like barely taste on her is untouched. It's unseen in this world. And like I said, the power system is ranked by jewels and how many dark jewels you can control. And she basically like has an unlimited amount, and she's like super scary powerful. And we get glimpses of that as the story progresses. We basically see her like interact with like a new thing, and they are intimidated by her. And she starts training with all of these things, and she starts uniting all of these races and creatures that have otherwise been enemies up until now. And it's basically a story of a girl rising into her power and just dominating the world. And of course there's like the good versus evil trope, as in almost all high fantasy, that there is also another queen who just is threatened by her powers and wants to take her out. So it's a lot of her being trained and being raised by her surrogate father and these two brothers who are kind of like meant to protect her as her life goes on, and coming into her power. Meanwhile, we know there are forces brewing like on the other side of the world of people who are like, oh, I hear there's a powerful chick coming around. We should not let that happen because it might overthrow my power. So that's the ultimate plot line. I basically read book 1 and didn't think that I would actually continue on with the series until the very end. The ending of this will rip your heart out, and it is rough. Like, it's, check trigger warnings for the series. It's pretty rough, but you basically get to see the glimpses of how cool Janelle is going to be. And I was like, oh, she's gonna be like an Aelin type of character. Like, she's super powerful, and we are just now starting to understand that. So I kept going. I feel like Anne Bishop sets up really good worlds and concepts, and she's really good at writing in the scale of things to the point where like you'll just read a certain line and you'll like get chills because you realize how big of a moment that is. So she's really good at moments like that, but I feel like she's not good at action. Like, the series felt like nothing really happened on page. Like, there were no big battles that happened on the page. There was not much action that happened. It was a lot of like political stuff, which is not my jam all the time, but it mainly kept me going because I just wanted to see Janelle burn the world to the ground. That's basically what I wanted to see. So I read this. Ooh, I also took your guys' recommendation from years ago at this point. A long time ago, I read a book called Stiff, and it's a nonfiction book about cadavers. I know, I'm taking a turn here with my reading tastes, or just myself in general. But that was a book basically about what happens to your body after you die, both from like a medical standpoint and like a scientific standpoint, but also just like technically what happens to it and all the different aspects of what you can do with it. And I talked about it, and a lot of you guys also recommended that I check out Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, and I finally got around to it. I'd like finally remembered to read it, and this is following a woman as she goes through a career working at a crematory, and it's basically her as like a young 20-something getting a job learning how to cremate bodies, and all of the weird stories that she has dealt with through her entire career. And she keeps it as a very lighthearted book, where I feel like if you work in the field of death, or just like kind of taboo, touchy subjects, you kind of have to have a dark sense of humor, and you have to be able to laugh about things, otherwise it's an incredibly depressing career path. So she writes all of these stories both in a very respectful and educational way, but also I laughed through a good portion of the book. So as somebody who kind of works not directly with death in this sense, obviously not with humans, but I work in the veterinary field and in rescue, or just in the reality of life, you deal with death a lot and you deal with bodies a lot. And I feel like we in Western culture are very stigmatized against death. It's terrifying. We don't talk about it. It's something that like nobody really discusses, so therefore the fear builds up. I love reading nonfiction books about this just because it's all things that people I know are morbidly curious about, but it's too taboo to ask questions about. This is a book that basically like pulls all the covers back and is like, so this is what happens, this is how a body burns, this is what happens if you get embalmed, this is what happens if you get buried. And I was just like, oh, this is very enlightening. So if you're a weird, morbid little creature like me, I would recommend that book and the book called Stiff, because both of them deal with that. So that's a thing that I read. Okay, so I finally read Save Me by Ashley Rostick. This is book 2 of the Witsex series. Talked about book 1 called Find Me last year in my favorites video. It is a contemporary, slightly dark reverse harem story that I cannot get enough of. It's been a very long time since I found an author that their writing just is addicting. Like, I cannot put the books down. And I was worried to read book 2 that like maybe my taste had changed since the first one, or maybe her writing declined or something. No, it was just as good. They're fairly short. There's a really cool underlying plot line of like a stalker and a past like murder that keeps the story moving, but it's about a girl who is in witness protection, and she moves in with her uncle, and she ends up falling in love with these 4 brothers who live next door to her. And it sounds cringy, but it is so good. So I read book 2 of that, and now I'm dying for book 3. So this is just an author that I think I'm just gonna periodically check back in with because her writing just works so well for me. Okay, I have another book that I'm gonna recommend to fans, if you're watching my channel, probably similar to me, of Sarah J. Maas, Jennifer L. Armentrout, the fantasy romance vibes that are finally starting to like make its mark on the genre. So I read a book called Untainted by Lillian T. James, and this gave me early Throne of Glass vibes, but in an adult setting. So Throne of Glass is very YA, especially the very beginning of that series is very young feeling. And if I were to go back at this point and start from Throne of Glass, it would be painful to get through that. So this, to me, feels very similar to the beginning of Throne of Glass, but written well and written for adults. So there's that. It's fantasy world, a girl who's an orphan. Obviously, we know that she's coming from something powerful because that's how stories work. And she is basically like training with a blacksmith guy to be as strong and fight with the guys. But as always, she's kind of put in her place. But through weird happenstance, she ends up traveling off with this prince, who is kind of like recruiting guards for himself. I don't know how to set the story up without like spoiling things or pitching it very well, because it's very much the start of a fantasy series. So we don't quite know what's going on yet. We know that there's attraction between these characters, and that we know she's powerful, and she is this missing orphan girl who is probably going to be a big political player at some point, because that's how fantasy series work. But it was so good. So it is only book 1 of a series, and that's the only one that's out. So my piece of advice is, if you want to read it, maybe wait closer to when the next book comes out, because it does end on a cliffhanger and I am distraught. So I read that. It's really good, but that's all I have. Then, of course, I read these puppies. Surprise to 0 people. I reread Crescent City. This is my first time rereading it since it came out 2 years ago. I'm gonna shock you guys. I didn't like Crescent City. As like a super fan of Sarah J. Maas, I really didn't like Crescent City. I'm not a huge fan of urban fantasy. I either want all the fantasy stuff or I want all contemporary. I don't like mixing them. It doesn't flow well for my brain. So I think that was my biggest qualm with it. The reread was better. I was more sold on it because I kind of knew what was going to happen and where the world was going, so I could like enjoy myself more instead of like panic reading through it. So my reread was better of book 1. And then we took on this puppy. I feel the same about book 2 until the ending. I will not spoil anything for you guys here. I have an entire video that you guys should go watch if you are also big Sarah J. Maas fans, because I talk about all of the things in a very manic episode of me just filming and word vomiting theories that I have. But basically, the last chapter of this book redeemed the entire series for me. So that's a thing. Do yourself a favor, if you haven't read it yet, read it before you get spoiled, because I would have rioted if that ending got spoiled for me. So I'm glad that I read it in like 2 days. So I don't really know what to say about these. Sarah J. Maas is just on a different level from other authors. She always has been, but she just put herself solidly on like a different shelf in my brain because she just did some stuff. I had to run laps around my house to calm down after finishing that book. And it's been a long time since I have been so legitimately physically excited about a book, so that felt good. That felt real good. I am currently working on this series, so I have finished book 1. I started book 2 yesterday, and I'm pretty sure I'm probably just gonna finish it today because these aren't super long, and also they read really fast. This is a serial killer romance. You heard me. I know. It's great. It is psychotic and gritty and great, and it's very fun to read. It's reminding me a lot of the Madly Darkly duet, which is another serial killer romance. If you have any interest in like dark romance and true crime podcasts, I'm gonna recommend this because this is serial killer, you know, stuff. So that's an experience that I'm having. What else have I read that I wanted to talk to you? I've read other stuff that was just kind of eh. I read the Heart Hassle series by Raven Kennedy. It's like the Cupid reverse harem. It was okay. It was funny, and like if you're looking for a very lighthearted romance series, reverse harem series that like very clearly does not take itself too seriously, that's a good series. It's like Signs of Cupidity, Bonds of Cupidity. It's about a Cupid who ends up with a whole bunch of fae men, and chaos ensues, and it's honestly very funny. Like, it feels cringy at times to me, but most of the time it's like I'm laughing out loud while I'm listening to it, so I did listen to that. I think that's all I have. I mean, I've read other stuff but like nothing really, none of those are worth talking about. So if you would like to hear my full thoughts, I do talk about everything I read on Patreon, usually during whip and chat videos. While I'm diamond painting, I'll just kind of fill you in on everything that I'm reading in real time. But so far, those are the books that have stood out to me the most this year. It feels weird to be doing a reading update like towards the end of February at this point, because normally I would have read so much, but that's what I've read so far, and it has been great. I've read some really good stuff already this year, so I feel like I'm setting myself up for success with good reading this year. So that's what I've been reading. Let me know down in the comments what you have been reading, and I'll see you guys in my next video.